Hey everybody, welcome to the 10% True podcast. Quick message from me before you get stuck in. This podcast is free, so there's no advertising. I don't monetize it on YouTube. You don't have to sit through any annoying adverts, and I don't even ask for any money through Patreon. But if you could, in exchange for that, drop me a like, leave a comment, share my content, and if you're listening to the podcast version, maybe leave a review of the channel. That would be hugely appreciated. It will help me to grow my audience, which is really what I'm trying to achieve. Anyway, with that, I'll let you get back to listening. Enjoy. Denny, welcome back to 10% Truth. Your third visit or our third discussion, so I appreciate you giving me your time again. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome, Steve. It's great to see you again.
Thank you.
This time, once again, in the sunshine in the UK.
Yeah, it's been a warm week, but it's going to change. So we're going to be back to the normal miserable weather of the UK. But anyway, it cheers me up to speak to you. So we are going to try and cover today then your time on the F-102 and on the F-101. So you were, before you got to the F-105, I'm stretching my mind back 2 interviews, but you were in Air Defense Command.
Exactly right.
You were in Air Defense Command.
That was my first assignment out of pilot training was to the F-102.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit about that then? So what was, for somebody not familiar with Air Defense Command and the picture in terms of geopolitical and international relations between the US and the Soviet Union in the 1960s, what was Air Defense Command tasked with doing?
Well, it was a joint venture between us and Canada. And if you go back into history, after World War II and the nuclear bomb was developed, this Cold War began. And the Russians had built this marvelous, still flying, marvelous bomber, Tu-95, the Russian Bear, and they had a lot of them, and so the worry was that these massive bomber assaults would come over the polar regions into the northern Canada as well as into the U.S. and so the Air Defense Command was built as a mechanism to be able to put forces in place to be able to counter that threat. And that's where the F-102 came in. Later, the F-105 and a terrific airplane, the F-106, which unfortunately I never did get to fly. It's a terrific airplane. But it was not only these particular aircraft systems that were built, but there were also ground-to-air missiles that were created to fire at these supposed bombers, and a huge radar line, the Defense Early Warning System, DEWS lines. And there are still very good radars that are sprinkled all over northern Canada that were our early warning system, to be able to look over the horizon and see the Russians coming and allow time for the North American Air Defense Command to respond to that. And there was a large command and control system that was built in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado to be able to help sort out the various radar inputs and other signals that they were picking up on, to be able to tell that, hey, we're under threat. We better get our active forces together. So that was the basic idea, was to stop the threat from coming in. Well, that resulted in the creation of a couple of concepts. We were put on, there were alert pads that were built on several runways that allowed a fairly short access to the runway. And the aircraft were put on alert. And we had basically 3 different types of alert that I set up. One was 5-minute alert. you got 5 minutes to get in the cockpit and be in the air, and get this thing fired up and buttoned up, and you're gone. The second one was a little bit longer, about 15 minutes, and that was kind of more of a backup force. They were armed exactly the same way as the aircraft that were sitting on 5-minute alert. So that was the two primary ones. The third alert system was one of the weapon systems that was created was actually an unguided nuclear rocket called later on it was called the AIM-26, and it was a nuclear missile. And the idea was you take off with this thing, get authority to launch it, and it would take out not just one airplane, but perhaps several. And so those were the alerts. And that one, we were on a 1 hour alert. And so I think the idea behind that was that they wanted to have pretty significant assurance that the country was really under active a threat, and they were coming before you ever launched these guys that had nukes on them. So, so there were several bases throughout Canada, as well as throughout the United States, that had aircraft sitting on alert.
What was the? I'd like to, because that was the Genie, wasn't it? Is that the name of the AIM-26 or the nuclear tip missile?
The nuclear one, yes.
The Genie. So just sticking with that then for a minute. Once you had launched on that mission, when you say you were waiting for permission to fire it, was there some kind of computerized interlock or something that would not allow that missile to leave the aeroplane until somebody on the ground had sent a launch code or something? Or were you trusted to simply
that was in the cockpit.
All right. So you would press a button and away it would go.
Yeah, you'd arm it and release it.
How old were you when you were flying that mission?
Let's see. Well, I was just a young bro. I was probably 22.
What did that feel like then? I mean, how did you feel about that flying in with that responsibility?
I was 24. I signed up when I raised my right hand and took the oath of office. And I basically wrote a blank check to be paid in full, to include giving your life if necessary to the United States. And I still feel very strongly about that commitment to what the job was. And it's really a trust in the national leadership to be able to make sure that they're expending over resources like me wisely. Well, we know darn well that didn't take place all the time, but in any event, I actually, in terms of thinking about firing a nuke weapon, I never thought about it that much. If you go back into that same time frame, the Army was developing nuclear-powered artillery, and so the concept of with smaller nukes and to be used in specific geographic areas, it was there. It was also at the same time that nuclear, these huge nuclear bombs are being dropped on ships and so our national psyche on nuclear warfare at that time was quite different than it is today. Right now, there's a lot of people looking back at having dropped that first bomb, second bomb, in Japan, and counteracting and all of that stuff, so that's a whole other discussion.
So what was the profile then for an AIM or a Genie launched? How far away would you launch it? And were you then going to get caught up in the explosion?
Turn.
Say again?
you turn, you just get the heck out of there.
Right.
You know, they fire the weapon and then break.
And so how far away would you be from the bomber force when you launched at them?
Well, actually not that far. I mean, it's you're talking, I don't know, maybe quarter of a mile, a little more.
Wow.
So you're fairly close. It's a rocket, and those years the rocket ranges weren't nearly as, the technology was nearly as developed as it is today. With and if you think about the creation of the Air Defense Command, we had just basically come out of World War II, and having fought against the Germans and the Japanese, and defeating their systems. It was about 1948 when the planners began thinking about this idea of creating a jet-powered interceptor, which eventually led to the development of the F-102, and with Convair having won that particular contract to build the airplane. Well, when they first built that F-102, they didn't have full understanding of the supersonic aerodynamics. There's a lot of learning taking place as you're building this thing. And the first airplane that they flew had I think it was a J-47 engine on it. And then they went to J-67. Neither of those were greatly underpowered. They went to a J-57, earlier version of it, to be able to get the aircraft to fly. And it was supposed to be a supersonic aircraft. It only got up to Mach 0.98. They couldn't get the thing to go supersonic. And they realized that the transonic drag was far higher than they had calculated and figured. And so what they wound up doing with the F-102 was stretching the fuselage 11 feet and making this Coke bottle area rule shape in there to allow the aircraft. And they also thinned the wing quite a bit. So they're learning how you make supersonic aircraft while they're doing it. This is the Convair guys that are building this thing. And, Lockheed, Kelly Johnson had a different idea with the F-104, so in any event, that was the early development of the F-102 and its concept and its role that it was playing in the Air Force. And the Air Force built over 1,000 of these.
Just on that then. Now, when we last spoke, I'd said, "Did you ever fly tacit blue?" And you said, "No, I'm not a test pilot." So having added the caveat, you're not a test pilot. Can you explain a little bit about why the area rule works? So you already described it as the Coke bottle. It's a sort of a pinched look, isn't it, when you look above? And I think the F-104 had it as well. Certainly. I'm pretty sure the F-104 had it, but are you able to explain, or would you be comfortable trying to explain how that works?
The F-105 also had it.
Yeah.
And as the air is going through past the fuselage, I'm not an aeronautical engineer. I'll leave that. My degree is in mechanical engineering, so I've worked with nuts, bolts, levers. So in any event, a lot of chemistry as well. Anyway, when the fuselage comes in like this, you create a little pocket of air in here, as compared to the air rubbing on the fuselage, and so the air that's in there, although it's moving, the air that's going past it is air passing air, as compared to air rubbing on metal and forcing its way back. And so that helped reduce the drag considerably. They also increased the thrust. considerably to be able to get this machine to go supersonic. And it got up to about 1.22 or 1.2. And that was its limiting speed, height roughly 53,000 feet.
What about the avionics fit then for the aeroplane? We really briefly touched on in the first interview, almost as an aside, the fact there was a data link. But can you talk a little bit about the radar in the aeroplane and that data link and how you as an operator use those things?
It's been many years since I've worked in this particular area, so my memory is a bit vague on exactly the concept, but it was generally what I'm remembering is we weren't getting a lot of automated input from control systems. We were working with the ground intercept controllers, people sitting on the ground, looking at a radar scope and steering us. And that's where we got our direction from, was from human people sitting at a GCI site somewhere, steering us around and talking to them on a radio.
Was some of that communication then instrumented? So if they wanted you to climb or take a certain heading, was there a heading caret on the ADI, or did something appear on your radar scope that?
Oh, it wasn't that sophisticated yet.
So
it was all verbal. Oh, by the way, speaking of the new interaction, when I was flying the aircraft in pilot training, the oxygen system was a diluted demand. That is, when you breathed in, the air came in. And then we could also hit so you get it under pressure. Well, in Air Defense Command, all the aircraft, when you put the helmet on and put the mask on and you turn the oxygen on, you got it at 100% under pressure. And so you had to learn how to breathe all over again. You relaxed to let the air in, and you had to force to exhale. And you had to learn how to talk all over again, because the initial conversations on the air by people who are just learning how to talk using this oxygen system, it was kind of comical to hear them, because for starters, you didn't understand what they said. That was something I hadn't anticipated.
Was that all the time? Is it pressure breathing all the time, or only above 50,000 feet? Or, I mean, from the moment if you were taxiing on the ground, you had your mask on, would you be pressure breathing?
Exactly.
Really?
It was 100% pressure breathing all the time.
So I am being unfair asking you to record details 50 years or so after the event, but do you remember then what a typical intercept looked like, again, from your point of view in the cockpit? Were you immediately under ground control from the moment you took off, or did that only happen at a certain point?
To take off, you're working with the tower and the departure control, and very often, if your mission is to go fly intercepts, you're going to be turned over to a GCI site on another frequency, and so you'll just be transferred over, and it's very not that much different than working with the air traffic control system, where you're climbing up to altitude and you go through various controllers and you're passed off one person to the next for heading information and what and them telling you what they wanted you to do to be able to deconflict the airspace. And the controllers, if we were out on an air intercept mission, would pretty much tell us. They would give us headings and altitudes to fly, and then they would tell us where the target was and the altitude of the target. And we practiced several different intercepts. Some from a quartering front, some, and depending upon the circumstance, we could fly. We had in the F-102, we had 12 folding fin aerial rockets in the doors, on both doors. So we had 24 of these things, and they're 2.5 inches or 2 3/4 inches in diameter, unguided. They just go rushing out. And if they hit something, fine. If they don't, they just fall to the earth. It's just, but we also had two. We had a capability of firing either heat-seeking aim-for rockets or semi-active radar. And so if you're working a friend intercept, you'd be using a semi-active radar to be able to attack us. There's no way the heat seeker is going to see that. And but if we were coming up from the rear, either a quarter, some angle off or right straight up the tailpipe, we could attack with the heat-seeking version. And the radar that was built by Hughes would allow us to be able to do this in all weather. And so, as a matter of fact, you could fly formation off of somebody by following the steering commands in the cockpit and your head is in the scope seeing this. You're not even looking outside. You're just looking at this thing. And have a radar controller on the left-hand yoke to be able to control, and you're flying the airplane with the right hand. And so in any event, we could come up to a kind of a station to be able to hold position on them. But it would also, the primary purpose was to get you into a firing position. And the machine would tell you, our radar, the radar, onboard radar would tell you when it's firing time. But before you ever got to do that, the radar controller, by steering you to the target, would, the obvious is you're going to go after this. And so we would, this would be recorded in the on the radar, so you could score yourself after you landed. People would look at you and look at your scores and see what you're doing and get some feedback on improving your performance.
I remember reading Robin Old's book about it was his autobiography, but he covers part of his time in Vietnam, and he talks about them bringing the AIM-4 Falcon, I think it was called, wasn't it? The AIM-4 Falcon to Vietnam.
A lousy missile.
Yeah, that's what he said. Did you know that at the time in Air Defense Command?
No, and of course I didn't. You don't know what you know until you know it, and and I didn't know any better.
Yeah.
At that time, I wasn't aware of other missiles that were out there at the time, and of course the one that I carried into combat in the F-105 was a Sidewinder. It's a terrific machine, and that's still here, being modified, and it has a terrific capability. But we didn't have those. We had Falcons.
Did you have any? So today there's WESIP, the Weapons Systems Evaluation Program, or something I think it's called, where they go to Tyndall and they'll shoot missiles. An operational squadron will get a chance to do that. Anything similar for you? Any opportunity to actually release live ordnance from the aeroplane while you were in Air Defense Command?
Not the F-102. F-101, different story. Because I did go through the F-101 training at Tyndall. There was a range available, and when I got into the F-105, we also fired a Sidewinder. We fire a rocket first, and then shoot a Sidewinder after it. And of course, the Sidewinder is faster than the first rocket, so it could get shot.
That's cool. That's cool. So can I just talk numbers then in terms of the threat versus what you were carrying? So the vision, this apocalyptic vision, is that hordes of these bears and badgers and things come over the horizon carrying their nuclear wares, and they're going to drop them on the continental United States, and you guys and the Canadians are going to launch and try and shoot them down. So if you've got the folding fin rockets, or you've got I don't know, was it 2 Genies you could carry or whatever, Presumably the Russians knew this, so they're not going to be flying in a nice tight formation and give you the opportunity to just pick them off like fish in a barrel. They're going to be using sneaky tactics. They'll be dispersed. What was your, as a community then in Air Defence Command, what were your predictions about how many of these things you were going to take out? And how did you deconflict with the ground defences? Because you had the Nike missile, and there would be the opportunity for engagement, just like you experienced over Vietnam, where it was a multi-layered defence. What did you think it would really look like if it happened?
I don't remember a lot of discussion on that, because I think in our heart of hearts, we hoped and thought that it would probably never happen. We knew we were there as a just in case. And I don't remember a lot of banter in the waiting rooms of people talking about that. I mean, most of the conversations were about a particular golf course, and normal day-to-day conversations. And so, the fairly deep esoterical discussions of potentials, they did take place, but it wasn't frequent. It was actually probably, I would say, more infrequent. In the Air Defense Command mode. I mean, it's we had our own job, like in the F-101. When I was flying that airplane, we would be sent off to, again, setting the stage. The Cuban Missile Crisis had taken place, and the Russians were flying theirs down to Cuba, and so we were sent out over the Atlantic to be able to intercept these aircraft and take pictures of them and so on. And even at night, we had this great big spotlight on the side of the aircraft that we could aim at the bomber to try to identify exactly what this machine was that we're looking at. And no doubt there were people that were interested in new antennas and new little blips and blobs that were showing up on the fuselage of that machine, and so on. And so that was our basic job was sitting on alert and get launched off and get tied up with a GCI controller. As far as deconfliction from the others, we pretty much depended upon what directions we were getting out of our controllers. So any deconfliction that was taking place was taking place via landline on the ground between some GCI site and whatever other defense site that happened to be around. We also had a transponder on the aircraft that would tell us who we were. And so that would be a means for anybody on the ground to be able to read our transponder and know that we were, who we were. And each aircraft had their own. So you could tell who is who.
I want to get to the F-101 in a minute, but just a couple of more questions about the 102 before we do that, Denny.
I got some stories on a 102, by the way.
Well, this is what I was going to ask. I was going to ask if there were particular missions that stand out in your mind, or anecdotes that you have to share.
The first thing that I got, it's when you sit in the cockpit of F-102, the intakes are sitting right here, and they're well forward of you. I had just come out of that T-38. T-38 was a very fast aircraft, great acceleration, terrific visibility. You're sitting in the cockpit and there's nothing there. You can look right straight up. So that was, this is interesting. And the takeoff roll was considerably longer because it had far less power. The thrust to weight ratio was very different than the T-38 that I had just flown. And as a delta wing aircraft, we pulled the nose up fairly high, relatively, and basically stayed there until the aircraft flew off the ground. And once you're airborne, there were no flaps. You just raise the gear and you're on your way. I found the aircraft that handled flight handling qualities were very, very nice. And it was an easy airplane to basically fly. There was a particular that we had learned in the T-37 called a flame out pattern. And you could, if the engine quit, you could fly over the aircraft or over the field and do a 180-degree turn or a 360 turn and come and get yourself lined up and land even without power. And we practiced that in the F-102. They call that high key and come on around. Other aircraft that I've flown, like the F-104, F-105, typically if you lost power, you're going to punch out. I mean, it's just that's the end of the hunt. I flew the F-102 at night. Oh, coming out of the chocks, the J57 engine, you get these choo-choo stalls. So if you had to be, I learned to be very ginger with the throttle control in the aircraft. And that stuck with me throughout my flying career. I never tried to abuse the engine. That's the only one you got. And so you moving the throttle just to get this thing to move, you had to kind of slowly advance the throttle. And once you got the thrust and it was moving, you'd be able to get the aircraft taxiing and get out to the runway. Same thing, running it up at the end of the runway to advance the throttle. Once you got out of the lower power regions, you could advance fairly rapidly to get up to full power and then advance it off into afterburner for takeoff. If you were flying at night and you were after a target and you got yourself slow and you tried to put a lot of rudder, the compressor stall was impressive. It would blow flames out the front end of the aircraft and they'd come pushing back over the cockpit. And so that happened to me once, and I said, "Don't do that again."
Did you have because it is a big delta wing airplane? So did you have any kind of? And you mentioned this in our very first interview. Again, just and we never really explored it, but you just said we never really did any basic fighter maneuvers against different aircraft or anything like that in Air Defense Command. No DACT or anything like that. But did it have any inherent capability against other fighters other than just being able to pull off one big turn, as you would expect from a delta wing?
Well, the aircraft had low wing loading. It was only 35 pounds per square foot. And so the aircraft could turn, but it didn't have a gun. See, there were studies that I've read about later on where they were thinking about adding weapon stores for an air-to-ground role, adding a Gatling gun in there, and so on. But the only thing that we had to be able to counter another aircraft, like another fighter, would have been these rockets and these Falcon missiles, and that's it. But being so underpowered, if the other aircraft climbed and you were climbing, the relationship between the climb angle and the airspeed indicator was pull back on a stick and the airspeed goes to zero. And you go like this. It's just
there's a drag curve then, which is exactly really what you're describing. So if you if there's a lot of airflow hitting the wing because you get into a higher angle of attack, then you need the power to be able to get out of that. So was the aeroplane particularly tricky to land because of that? Were there some?
No, but if you stall the aircraft, one of the characteristics of the F-102 was interesting. You could be descending at 10,000 feet a minute, and you could see this on your altimeter as your rate of descent indicator, and if you rolled the aircraft to the left, it would roll, it would respond. And to the right, if you pull the nose up, the nose would come up. you're still going down like a rock, but the nose would come up. So you had to actually push the nose down and get the airspeed back up into where the airplane is actually flying and no longer stalled to get out of that. And that did kill people. And so, what I learned a lot of things about flying airplanes, flying the F-102. And one of them is don't get behind a power curve. Because if you get behind a power curve, you can be hurting. And you've got to have altitude to be able to recover from that. But once if you maintain the reasonable approach and you look at the runway and you maintain that, that was okay. One of the things that I had to get used to is I had this split screen in the front. So you got the iron bar sitting right there in front of you. And so you're looking out the right window or the left window. And after a while, it became, you didn't even notice it. You learned how to work your way around it. But it was kind of a noticeable thing. The other thing about the F-102 that is true also in the F-106 is that the cockpit stopped right back here. So the visibility aft was terrible. And you could see that. But in order to be able to see behind you, you actually have to turn the airplane and get a view. And so the aircraft was never built to be an aircraft that was an air-to-air fighter. It was built to be an air-to-air interceptor. And that's a different construct. Airplanes like the F-100, different story. Those guys practiced that air-to-air maneuvering, and their canopy would allow that. And even though they flew with that same engine, J75, the variant, the amount of thrust they had was about the same. I've never actually looked up what the wing loading is on the F-100 because I never had a chance to set foot in it. And but ABC never did that, not once. No, there was a time when flying the F-101 that it had a much higher wing loading. It was up around 130 pounds or something like that per square foot. Really? And so it was quite a transition for me to go from the F-102 to the F-101.
Can you talk about that then? So what for the layperson, you've talked about a 36 or so pound versus 132 pound between the 102 and the 101. What does that actually mean then in terms of you as a pilot and how the airplane feels and how you treat the airplane, how you fly it?
Well, if you have a lot of power with a low wing load on your airplane, you can make small circles when you're turning. And if you have high wing loading, you're going to be making a much larger circle. Now, what that means in combat is if you're flying an F-105, which has a wing loading up around 100 pounds, about 93 pounds per square foot, and you're trying to fight a MiG-17, that guy's going to turn inside you and roll around and be on your tail. And that's the impact of wing loading.
So from an interceptor point of view, which I'm guessing if you were to simplify it is really a case of, how quickly can you get to a point in space and time from the moment which you launch. Does wing loading make a difference, or is it just really when you come into the turning fight or turning capability that it's important?
It's only in the turning fight where it's important. Or at the slower end of the airspeed envelope, how slow you can get this thing before
you mentioned, Denny, when you talked about the F-101, the Voodoo, that it really had fantastic power and climbed really well. What other characteristics of the airplane did you like?
Well, it's a much larger aircraft for starters. It was higher than the F-102. I had two people. I had a radar intercept officer in the backseat that had his job was to be able to operate the radar, and he would quote, turn the airplane over to me to go actually fire the missile on. And that was an immediate, and as I mentioned to you earlier, it had terrific power. When the advanced the throttle, it had two engines, both J57s, and they had a hard light. And so when you went into the afterburner, you felt the boom. And so I would advance one engine and then the second one to make sure they're both lit. And then just advance the throttle right up, to the full afterburner, and fairly quickly start raising the nose, and fairly quickly the nose would be off the ground, the airplane would be airborne, and immediately retract the landing gear. And the reason for that is the nose landing gear rotated forward. And if you got too fast, there's too much air pressure to overcome that little actuator that's trying to struggle that gear up into the wheel well, and you trap it. And now you're sitting there and say, oh, rats, hung gear. So you got to come out there, AB, slow down, get the gear up, go back into afterburner, and then you buy the bar when you get back.
What was the evolution then between the 102 and the 101 from a sort of an air defense command point of view then? So you've added a second person into the cockpit. You've got more power. Presumably you can get from the runway to where you need to be, the intercept point, more quickly. What was the addition of that second person then in some way going to improve the quality of your interception? What did that nav bring, or did that radar operator bring to the party?
Having the radar intercept officer in this particular role added a fair amount of capability. We still were getting direction from the GCI controller, but it reduced the workload on the pilot quite a bit. When I was flying the F-102, I'm listening to the controller and talking to him. And by the way, I'll get back to this a little bit. On the yoke, on the right-hand stick, there's a little button up there. F-105, we call that the pickle button. And but in Air Defense Command, this is used as a mic. We had one on the throttle, and we had one up here. But if your hand is on the stick, you can't touch that one. Well, you can, but it's kind of awkward. So you had this one to be able to talk, and so you're doing all this stuff, and we're in the F-101B. The radar intercept officer was actually the guy that was setting up and giving me steerage and and direction to fly and so on. So, and he was setting up the intercept where I didn't have to worry about that. He was doing that. All I had to do was, once he got this thing locked on to the target, I would get this command signals on a device in the cockpit where I would then follow this dot and see it approaching the target, and I would get an indication of when I should be holding down the trigger to fire a weapon, having it all armed up and ready to go. And so that was basically my job as a pilot, was to arm it up, make sure I got the right weapon selected, communicating with the fellow in the back to make sure that I got the right one set, and go from, and then actually fly the aircraft. He did not have a stick in the back seat, so he not able to do it, unless it happened to be a trainer model where there was an F model and they had a stick in the back, but they also still had the same scope.
One thing, when you were talking about the fact in the F-102 there was no sort of data-driven command and control from the GCI side, i.e. there were no little carrots on the instruments to tell you when to climb and descend and where to turn to and heading, all that kind of stuff. It was all done verbally. One thing I wondered was whether how vulnerable that method would have been to comms jamming, and I think the Russians had a big emphasis on comms jamming. So did this? So a is that the case where was there a vulnerability to being comm jammed, and B, did the addition then of that radar intercept officer mitigate against that?
I think in many ways it did. The air traffic controller on the ground would get us headed off into a specific direction. But if we were after a target, sometimes I saw contrails coming at me, and they were 80 miles away.
Wow.
So a lot of this stuff we could set ourselves up visually, and but the only difference is I didn't know if that was an airliner or if that happened to be a bomber. It's just.
Did you not also and again, I'm showing my ignorance here, on the F-101B, did you not also have a little infrared sensor somewhere in front of the forward?
We sure did.
Yeah.
And that was a mod that was added on the aircraft. It's actually a ball about that large that was set right in front of the front cockpit. And yes, we did have a IR intercept capability, which we practiced.
How did that differ then from a radar intercept?
We still had steerage. It would give you range and elevation, not range, but the radar is going to give you range. IR is just going to give you direction and altitude. But you can't. It's not going to tell you how far out it is. Radar will.
Could you tie together those two systems? So could you find something on radar and hand it over to the IR sensor?
I think the RIO had that capability to be able to take advantage of both of those. As I mentioned in the front cockpit, all I got was what he locked on and set me to.
Okay.
And so I would receive the information of what he's working in the back seat.
What did you really think of the F-101 then in terms of a pilot's aeroplane? Did you enjoy flying it?
I've enjoyed every aircraft. Again, F-101 I learned a lot. It had a high T-tail. And so one of the characteristics of that particular aircraft is it would pitch up. And there were people that were killed when the aircraft pitched up. One of the characteristics was we had vanes on the left and right side of the fuselage on the outside that would measure the angle of attack. And if you exceeded a certain angle of attack, you're going to get a horn, in this case it would be a stick shaker, because the F-104 had the same issue. And so I'm getting them both confused. And in any event, you get the stick shaker, and if you kept on going, they're actually going to drive the stick forward for you, uncommanded by you. It's going to push your aircraft forward. And so I learned how to read the aircraft, because I noticed that before you start getting the shaker, the nose of the aircraft is going to start to move on its own. It's going to kind of start seeking, it's very light on the touch. So I learned to be able to have a fairly light touch on the aircraft. Didn't horse it around very much. And because that aerodynamic response was telling you, the airplane is telling you something. And so I learned about that. Once, if the aircraft pitched up, you could recover the aircraft, and it would go up and over and into basically a spin. So we had a drag chute on the aircraft, and we would pop the drag chute, and that would force the nose down. And then when you got back, your airspeed back up to recover from the dive, you could drop this, punch off the drag chute and or it would shred as it accelerated. And then you go back and land the airplane. And then you buy the bar, you go talk to the commander.
Did that ever happen to you?
No. I've had the shaker hit. Matter of fact, there was a couple of times where I learned a lot about, you're talking about wing loading. We had just completed an intercept on a B-52, about 32,000 feet. And this B-50, beautiful big airplane, he started turning, and I tried to turn inside of him. No way. I mean, I got this shaker, and and it just boom. The B-52 was going that way, and I was going that way, whether I wanted to or not. And so I learned a lot about feeling of the aircraft and so on, and that came into play in other aircraft that I flew later on. But once they lowered the landing gear, you still get the shaker, but the kicker would never happen again because it would not drive your nose down as you're trying to land the airplane, and that wouldn't work out well. And so in any event, I learned how to quote read the aircraft. Coming around base to final turn, if you start getting the shaker, back off some, and add power, and if you're going to overshoot the runway, go wrong, come back, try it again.
What was the sort of typical number of hours you would fly every month then? I mean, I'm curious. It's interesting to hear you talk about learning things and sort of getting to know the feel of the airplane and to be light on the stick, and then you taking those lessons with you. How many hours were you flying, and what did a typical week look like in terms of sortie numbers?
Well, I flew the F-101 from January of 66 until around the end of April of 67. And in that time frame, so that's a year and 3 months. Is that about right?
Yeah.
If my calculation's
Yeah.
right. I got 278 hours in the F-101.
Okay. That's not so bad.
Total time. So we were getting 20, 30 hours in a month.
Yeah.
And you roll into that, some vacation time and so on.
Did you do a lot of TDY? Did you go and visit other units and?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we did. In the F-102, no, it's always in training, totally. But in Charleston, yes. We went TDY from Charleston Air Force Base. I went to the 444th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Charleston, and we had a detachment over north of us at Wilmington International Airport in Wilmington, North Carolina, where we were sitting on 1 hour alert with a nuclear weapon, and so we were there a lot. The TDYs that we had went down to a gunnery meet at Tyndall from Charleston, and the other, we would fly to typically up to Langley, Virginia, because they had an F-106 unit that was stationed there, and we had F-101s. And one of the practices that Air Defense Command had was to not only train the air crews, but we're also training the weapons and load controllers who are loading the aircraft. And so we would fly up to Langley, land the airplane, and their weapons controllers that typically worked on F-106s were cross-trained to be able to work on the F-101. And so, and likewise, they would fly an F-106 from Langley down to Charleston, and our F-101 loaders were able to work on an F-106, cross-trained on the 6. And the reason for that was if hostilities took off, I could be diverted to any base someplace in Air Defense Command, and those people would have to be able to operate my machine. And likewise, somebody from someplace else could wind up in Charleston, and our people would have to have the capability, training to handle that. So in that sense, there was a fair amount of TDY involved.
So what was your favorite of the Century Series fighters that you flew?
I prefer blondes. I'm married to a blonde. They're also different. I actually really do not have I guess F-104 and F-105 together, I would have to say, would be my favorite. And if I had to pick between those two, that's going to be tough. The 105 brought me back through some hellacious time. I had, what did I get in the thud? Flying time wise, probably 655 hours in the F-105, and I had 680 hours in the F-104. And so the F-104, I think, probably brought back fonder memories, and we can talk about that now. And part of that is because of what we did with the airplane, where we were living and what we were doing, and people we were meeting. When I finished the F-101, I got orders to fly the F-105 combat, and then, as I mentioned earlier, after my combat tour at Korat, including a month TDY up in Tok Lee, flying with the 357th on Squadron Exchange from Korat. I then went to Okinawa, from Okinawa to McConnell, Wichita, Kansas, the F-105, turned the airplane over to the Guard and Reserve, and then off to the F-104 in Phoenix, Arizona. And that was kind of a shock, because the temperature in Wichita and the temperatures underground in Phoenix are dramatically different. And one of the behaviors that took place in Phoenix is that around 1st of May, bets would start taking place on what day and what hour of the day that a person could fry an egg on a wing of an F-104. Because it was blistering hot. And to go from the F-105 to the F-104 was an interesting transition for me. The cockpit of the F-105 is about 13 feet in the air. So, I mean, it's a big airplane. The F-104, just the opposite. I mean, you can almost stand on the ground and you look right straight at the pilot in the eye. He's slightly higher, but not that much. And so the aircraft is much closer to the ground. And of course, the cockpit is totally different, and you learn how to fly that. But what I found with the F-104 is because its wing loading is not that much different than the F-105. The 105 wing loading was 93 pounds, and the F-104 wing loading was what is the 104 wing loading? 105 pounds. So it's it would make slightly larger circles than the F-105, but the feel of the stick controls, and when you turned it and pull the nose up and so on, unless you're actually looking at the cockpit itself, you could tell very little difference between that and the F-105. And the mission in the F-104, initially, that Kelly Johnson designed it was as an interceptor. The mission that I flew it in was ground attack. We also flew the aircraft in air to air. We taught basic fighter maneuvers. We taught advanced combat tactics and so on in the F-104. And there's lots of stories to tell in that regard. Because I wound up leading the F-104 German Air Force, U.S. Air Force Fighter Weapons School at Luke.
Okay.
And
that sounds to me like that sounds to me like it's a separate interview.